So, um, The Sorrows of Young Werther is a 1774 novel by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe about a young man who is full of angst and makes bad choices. And he wears a yellow waistcoat. I hope I'm pronouncing these names all right. German speakers, feel free to criticize me. Werther's Original is a very popular brand of caramel candy created in the town of Werther in Germany in 1909. They were first sold under the name Werther's Echte in 1969, then later as Werther's Original to appeal to an international market. And they have golden yellow wrappers. So I thought it would be a good idea to make a 1770s waistcoat covered in Werther's wrappers. Before I could begin my waistcoat, I had to save up a lot of Werther's wrappers, which I did slowly over a number of months. Once I had accumulated a waistcoat's worth of Werther's wrappers, I washed them to make sure there was no candy residue on them. To my shock and dismay, the washing took flakes of the shiny printing off of some of the wrappers. In hindsight, I think my water might have been a bit too warm. Thankfully, it was only really bad on a few of them, and most of them were fine. My main fabric is this lightweight pale yellow cotton that's been in my stash for years. I decided to stick my wrappers to it with heat and bond, and did several samples before doing the actual waistcoat pieces. The heat and bond worked decently well, but the wrappers were still fairly easy to peel off. No! So I added closely spaced vertical lines of stitching for extra security. Before fusing candy wrappers to fabric, it's best to iron them nice and flat. I set my iron to a fairly low setting to avoid melting and destroying the wrappers, which looks like this in case you were wondering. I pulled and smoothed out the twisty bits of the wrappers first to try and cut down on wrinkles, and pressed them between a silk organza press cloth and a cotton muslin one. I like my organza press cloth because it protects things from direct contact with the iron, but it's transparent so you can still see what's going on. I ended up using a total of 128 wrappers, 57 on each side of the front and 7 on each pocket flap. I wanted the gold stripes to be wider than the yellow ones, so I cut the transparent edges off of half my wrappers, and used rows of them in between the rows of complete wrappers. I traced and cut out my waistcoat fronts and pocket flaps in the heat and bond, leaving about 8mm of seam allowance, and fused those pieces to my yellow cotton. I thought it best to fuse all my wrappers before cutting out, just so things would lay flatter and not get distorted. I did it in rows starting from the front, and using a ruler to make sure they were lined up straight. Here you see me using a plastic ruler which I taped in place at first, but I later switched to a metal ruler that was heavy enough to stay still on its own, because it turns out that even the gentle adhesive of painter's tape will remove small specks of the gold printing from ironed Werther's wrappers. I was careful to keep the iron only on where the wrappers were so as not to fuse my press cloth to the fabric. I didn't want the words on the wrappers to be cut up, so I spent a while sorting them and lining them up before fusing them, trying to get the partial words more or less matched up. Once I had applied all the wrappers, I traced my pattern pieces onto the back of the fused areas and cut them out. I make my patterns without seam allowance, so my tracing line here is also my stitching line. Then it was time to sew a lot of parallel lines. I used a nice contrasting dark brown on the gold stripes and a pale yellow on the yellow ones, which matched so well it's practically invisible. I ran out of both colours while doing it and had to go to Fabricville to get more, so it took a couple of days to get them all finished. I sewed onto a scrap of fabric in between sewing each line, to save on thread and to avoid the bother of lots of thread tails everywhere. I was kinda disappointed with how this looked when I first stuck all the wrappers on, but I like it a lot better after adding the stitching. I think doing dark brown stitches on the gold stripes to match the printing made them look a lot more cohesive and less like garbage. Also, yes, I know big bold stripes like this are not accurate for 1770s waistcoats, or for most menswear for most of the 18th century. Stripes were very popular in the 1780s and 90s, but for the 80 years before that, with a few exceptions, you just don't see striped suits. So if a waistcoat looks like this in the 1770s, then it's probably a casual, relaxing at home one that comes with a matching banyan. Which doesn't matter at all when the stripes are made of... but I still wanted to mention it. After sewing all the lines, I gave the pieces another press for good measure. I'm constructing this in the same way I would a normal 1770s waistcoat, so the fronts are interfaced with buckram, which I made by stiffening linen scraps with diluted white glue. Not the most historically accurate goop with which to make your buckram, but it's what I have and it works. I cut separate pieces of buckram for the center front and the angled bit along the bottom edge, and overlapped the ends and machine stitched them together. I also added an extra layer where the lowest few buttons will be. More out of habit than necessity, as this won't be worn enough to need any extra reinforcement. Since any hole I poke through the plastic wrappers is permanent, I can't paste or pin things like I usually do, so I'm using paper clips. Before attaching the buckram, I had sewed a little buttonhole sample, and found that the gold printing wore off with excessive handling. This isn't a problem on new, untouched wrappers, so I suspect the heat from the iron must have weakened the gold somehow. To try and minimize this as best I could, I proceeded with a suede glove on my left hand. I originally cut out the pocket flap interfacing in the same buckram as the front edges, but with this already stiff fabric it was just too much, so I recut them from very thin buckram and will save the stiffer ones for another waistcoat. The paper clips did a pretty good job of holding the buckram while I carefully sewed it in place with yellow silk thread. They did scratch the gold a little bit, but it's fine. I'm doing big stitches on the underside and leaving very tiny ones on the outside. I used a knife to cut open the pocket holes slightly below where the pocket flaps will be, and folded and pressed the edges. I also pressed in the edges on all sides of the pocket flaps, and all along the fronts except for the side and shoulder seams. Around this time I also cleaned my iron, since I was done with the fusible stuff. My lining is this off-white cotton sateen remnant from Renaissance fabrics. I lined the pocket flaps first, slowly hand stitching around the edges with the help of more paper clips. Normally this is one of my very favorite steps in 18th century tailoring, but it's not nearly as fun when you're doing it on stiff plastic material that you're trying not to handle too much. The gold still wore off a bit on the glove, but less than it would have on a sweaty hand. The pocket bags are made of the same cotton as the lining. I sewed the two halves together by machine and whip stitched them to the pocket opening. I'm using white linen thread from Burnley and Trowbridge. I know I just said I can't pin through this stuff, but this bit is underneath the pocket flap, so the pinholes won't show. Normally I baste the pocket flap in place before sewing it on, but here I can't do that, so I tried pinning the underside of the flaps down through the lining and buckram layers. They're stitched on with yellow silk thread, which is doubled and waxed. I marked out the 9 buttonholes on the buckram because pencil doesn't really work on candy wrappers, and marker would probably smudge everywhere and stain my yellow top stitching. I cut them open with this buttonhole cutter, which is way too small. I should think about getting a bigger buttonhole chisel. And I overcast them with more of the yellow silk thread. At this point I marked out the button locations on the opposite side through the holes, which is easy to do without the heavier stitching in the way. I sewed the buttonhole stitches with a dark golden yellow DMC cotton pearl and did little bar tacks at each end. Wearing the glove made this pretty awkward, and the stiffness of the material made doing the little buttonhole stitches on the bar tacks more tricky than usual, so they're not my prettiest buttonholes, but all things considered I think they turned out nicely. The wrapper fabric seemed horribly unsuitable for cloth-covered buttons, so I made 6 pointed death's head buttons in the same thread as the buttonholes, with 1 round of contrasting dark brown wraps. I won't go into that here because I already have an entire video on how to make them. Link in the description. I really don't think you'd be likely to see multicolored death's head buttons as early as 1774, but like the stripes, we're just going to ignore that. I'm not making this to be historically accurate, I'm making it because I thought it would be funny. Much like the pair of denim breeches I made a few years ago just so I could call them Jeeches. After those were all sewn on, it was time to line the fronts. I stitched the lining down around the whole front edge, and that little side vent bit, but left it open at the side and shoulder seams. Normally I would sew it down around the front portion of the armhole too, but I was a bit worried that the stiffness would make the shoulders fit badly and that I'd need to trim them down, so I left those for later. I don't like that I'm wearing a black glove in all these shots. It makes it look like I'm doing crimes and trying not to leave fingerprints. On the half with the buttonholes, I did that thing where you cut open the lining just behind the finished buttonhole and whip stitch it down. I've gotten nice results with this technique before, but my lining was not behaving nicely, and was especially hard to tuck under and sew down what with the outer fabric being so stiff. I accidentally mistook this ridge for the whole part of the buttonhole, and I cut along there, and now I have a chunk missing. It's fine. I'll cover it up with this little piece of cotton tape. Now I've got blood on it, but the cotton tape's working pretty well. After dabbing the bloodstains with a tiny bit of peroxide and rinsing that corner of the waistcoat with water, I finished the rest of the buttonholes without incident. I didn't tuck the edges in on these ones, and they did fray a bit, much less nice than when you line things with taffeta. I'm not happy with the way the buttonholes look on the inside, and I don't know why I didn't just sew them through all the layers. It's not like I'm going to be replacing the lining in this. Oh well. When lining the button side, I realized I could just wrap a bit of scrap fabric around one finger instead of wearing an entire glove. The waistcoat back is a heavy natural linen twill from Pure Linen Envy, and it's unlined. I backstitched the center back seam with a fairly heavy grey linen thread, then felled the seam allowance and hemmed the edges of the vent at the bottom. The other edges of the back will be finished a bit later. Here I'm just clipping the corners so the two hems overlapping won't be quite as bulky. Before sewing the side and shoulder seams, I basted them and tried it on to check the fit. It was a little loose, so I took the side seams in a bit. I could have taken them in even more, but the fronts are so stiff that would have caused some awful wrinkles. This is one of the things I really love about this method of construction. Having the buttons and buttonholes all finished before the front and back are joined means you can baste the side and shoulder seams and see exactly how it'll fit before you commit to sewing them. I backstitched the sides and shoulders with more of the white linen thread. I could have sewn these and the center back by machine, but I didn't want to. I hemmed the other lower side edge of the back piece, and the bottom, and the armhole bit. For the very top edge of the back, you usually want a bit more reinforcement, so I stitched on this little bit of facing cut from a different linen scrap. The very last steps were to whip stitch down the lining to cover the seam allowances on the sides and shoulders, and finish sewing it to the front edge of the armhole, which didn't need trimming down like I thought it might. Then it was finished! The wrappers were challenging to work with, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't terribly hard to put a needle through, and the edges folded over and pressed more nicely than I thought they would, but I had no idea that gold would rub off. That, combined with how stiff the material was, made a lot of parts pretty awkward to sew. Overall, I'm very pleased with how this turned out. I don't know when I'll ever wear this. It's unpleasantly stiff and plasticky, and a little more gold comes off every time I touch it. Plus, yellow isn't really my color. But it is made! I finished it! And now there's one less foolish project idea at the back of my mind, so I'm glad I did. Also, Werthers are very tasty, and it was nice to save up all those wrappers. That sounds kind of advertisement-y, but I promise you it's not. I just think they're pleasant candies. Despite having just made an entire waistcoat and video inspired by the sorrows of young Werther, I don't actually like the book very much. It's written as a collection of letters in which he constantly complains about everything and gets more and more miserable as the book goes on. It ends very badly and it's just not a fun time. But hopefully this video was. Here, this one's for you.